One of the ways that we talk about beating burnout is not about doing more well-being, it's not about getting more resilience. That is a product of setting boundaries, saying no, protecting your time, managing your energy and keeping yourself at that top of the curve in your performance zone.
It's another myth we tell ourselves that, well, if I can just keep work going, then everything will be successful. Believing that we operate in a vacuum, that having problems at home isn't going to impact how we show up at work and how we perform. It's all interconnected.
Do you sometimes find yourself doing stuff because you're not really clear whose job it was in the first place? And now it feels too difficult to ask. Or you know that it really shouldn't be part of your role, but there doesn't seem to be anybody else available to do it. And if it doesn't get done, you know it's going to end up with you anyway. We've all done this, but my guest today says this isn't just about people pleasing or poor boundaries. Often it's a role clarity problem, because when nobody is clear about who's responsible for what, the most conscientious people end up carrying everything. Leanne Elliott is a chartered occupational psychologist, workplace culture consultant, and co-host of the chart-topping Truth, Lies and Work podcast, where she helps people to understand the psychology of work and build healthier, more effective teams. In this episode, we talk about why busy has become such a dangerous marker of success, why over-responsible people become the safety net for broken systems, how lack of role clarity is one of the biggest things fueling resentment and burnout, and how you can get clearer on what is actually required of you at work, even if you're the boss. If you find our podcast helpful, it really does make a difference when you leave us a review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're watching on YouTube, do hit subscribe so you never miss an episode. If you're ready to stop carrying responsibility by default and start getting clearer about what is and isn't yours to carry, do enjoy this episode.
Hello, my name is Leanne Elliott. I'm a chartered occupational psychologist and co-host of the Truth, Lies and Work podcast, which is dedicated to helping our listeners simplify the science of work and build amazing workplace cultures.
It's wonderful to have you on the podcast, Leanne. There's so much I want to ask you about. But firstly, I know you work with professionals in high stakes, high stress jobs, and you've worked in the NHS, you work with leaders, you look at their workplace culture, and a lot of the people you work with are running on empty. They've got nothing left in the tank. What does that look like in practice? What have you noticed that sort of produces in the organisation or in teams or for the person?
I see a lot of a symptom of burnout. I'm not sure we talk about very often is cynicism. So we know that burnout has three main symptoms by the official definition from the World Health Organization, which is exhaustion, detachment from work, and cynicism. And one that I see a lot when people are running on empty and the system isn't supporting them in their work or their well-being is this cynicism. And that can look like infighting, incivility, relationships breaking down, a lack of being able to find solutions, being stuck in this state of this is how it is, so what am I going to do about it? A lack of control. And that is a really hard place for anybody to be. And it's particularly hard for a collection of people to be. So when everybody's feeling that way, it's really hard for any leader to try and dig everybody out.
And when people are being really cynical, do you find that turns on each other or the system or their patients and clients or a bit of everything?
Yeah, all of the above, depending on the situation. And I think often in teams where they are quite close knit and the cynicism starts to creep in, it is probably directed more externally. So towards senior leaders or towards clients or customers. If that group hasn't got that strength in terms of those relationships, which is a really important aspect, then it can turn on each other. And I think this is where it can be really useful for a leader to think about in terms of a solution is my team, we're lacking cohesion. So is it that they're lacking social cohesion where these relationships are breaking down, or are we lacking task cohesion where there's something in the workflow that's breaking down and it's making everybody's jobs harder? And so we're pointing at somebody and saying, oh, well, they didn't do that, which means I can't do this, et cetera, et cetera. So it can be much easier to fix task cohesion because that's very operational. Social cohesion takes longer and is actually usually a really helpful byproduct of task cohesion because it helps build that civility and respect. So if there's infighting, the first question I would want to ask is this a relationship issue or is it a task-based issue? Because one is much easier to start to solve.
That's interesting. And when you find it's a task-based issue, is it because people don't know what they should be doing with the task, or is it because people don't know what tasks should genuinely be theirs or not?
Again, both, depending on the situation. I think role clarity is a really big issue within organizations, in particular, I think within organizations where there is a lack of resources, like the NHS. There are lots of people that will pick up extra responsibilities as part of their role because they feel that responsibility to do so. They want to provide a good service to clients and patients, customers. So yeah, there's a issue around role clarity, and that's actually what we call in the psychology literature a psychosocial risk factor, which basically means it's an element of our work environment that if it isn't being served or handled in the right way will cause stress on the individual. And often we think about psychosocial risk factors, the more obvious ones like lots of change happening within the organization or relationships breaking down. Role clarity is a core psychosocial risk factor. So if someone doesn't have clarity over their role, what their responsibility is overstretching, then yeah, it's going to potentially cause these tasks to break down. It can also just be a lack of clarity around the tasks themselves in terms of what needs to be done, in what order, why it needs to be done, because then we're not having shortcuts made, and often shortcuts aren't very, impactful. I actually called this, I'm not sure if there's swearing on your podcast.
Go ahead and swear.
An official term, but I heard it described as this and I thought it was brilliant. We talked about it recently on Truth, Lies and Work, is there's a shortcut and there's a shitcut. And a shortcut is a way of streamlining processes in a way that just makes it then the way. It's not a shortcut because if it works, let's just keep doing it that way. A shitcut is when we chop something out or we miss the critical thinking that then means that the solution we get to or the action that we execute is ineffective. And the more of that we have, the more problems, they compound and make performance almost impossible.
We see shitcuts all the time in the NHS, and often I think they are implemented by perhaps managers that have no idea about what's happening on the ground with patients. So they go, this is a good idea. Let's do this shitcut. Let's cut the amount of people we need. Let's cut the resources because it will work. And then it absolutely creates havoc on the ground. Is that the sort of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And often there's intention, it's in the right place. It comes from a good place often. And I think we can sometimes villainize our leaders and managers because it feels easier to blame them when they're making changes that we haven't been consulted on. And that's the key, staff consultation. It can feel like, I don't have time to go and ask people. And even when you do ask them, they might be thinking, I don't have time to sit and answer these questions. But the reality is we need that data, we need that information to be able to make effective decisions and also give the individual that this change is going to impact some agency in that and some control over that. And we also know as well from the psychology literature that how change is managed is a psychosocial risk factor. And one of the key ways of supporting change is to have people consult on that change, have their say on that change. It's not to say we have to do everything that they want it to do, the way they want to do it, because sometimes there's organizational constraints or service constraints, but just that conversation is going to massively accelerate the success of any change implementation.
It's a no-brainer, isn't it? Because if you consult to people about the change, you get to know what those shitcuts are going to be and what's going to work and what's not going to work. So it's a bit of it's like when people aren't consulted, like, what were you thinking? But I want to come back to that because I know that you've done a lot of work around sort of conflict and why we avoid conflict and stuff. But I want to go back to role clarity because we recently did a survey to people on our mailing list. We had over 300 responses and over 60 of those responses were mentioning the issue of role clarity, because we were asking them, why do you feel unable to say no to stuff? Why do you always take on the default responsibility for everybody? Because our listeners are people that I think feel responsible for everybody and everything all of the time. And I hadn't realised that role clarity was such a big problem. But when you delve down into it, of course it's a problem, because if you have the mindset of, if I don't do it, who else will? If you're not clear on what your role is, you will just accept that, oh, if no one else will, that must be my job and that must be my role. Do you see that playing out? How else have you seen lack of role clarity playing out, particularly in people who are very conscientious and over-responsible?
There's an element to organizational life as individuals that we experience called discretionary effort, basically going the extra mile. And that's kind of a double-edged sword of us being engaged in our work. And typically people in the NHS are very engaged in their work because they feel a sense of real purpose and meaning to their work, and they can see the impact it has both at a local level and at a societal level. So discretionary effort is a byproduct of being engaged in meaningful work. And it's great because it makes us feel that we're gaining energy, we're really contributing to something. But when it goes too far, particularly with a lack of resources, that results in burnout, because we're trying to take on everything we can because we have this sense of responsibility to do so. So with a lack of clarity around our role, there's even more of a temptation to do that, because, as you say, if I'm not going to do it, who else will do it? And it needs to be done. The other slight issue with role clarity as well is where we then start to see where we'll slip into more incivility and amongst teams, is if people are overreaching for tasks that aren't their responsibility and somebody very much sees them as theirs. So they'll feel that they're being undermined. They'll feel like they're being potentially micromanaged. There's lots of ways that can be interpreted from the individual whose task is being taken away from them or being overridden by somebody else. There's also a real danger in terms of role clarity, particularly in an organization, a health-based organization where you've got patient care and outcomes to think about, is if that task isn't done because somebody doesn't see it as their responsibility and feels no need to overreach, and there is that then gap in a process that is very critical to either operations or to patient care. And that is where we can see much more impactful issues within an organization or to an individual, because there isn't that clarity over who should do something. And there's lots of examples actually in terms of the literature that falls into more kind of health and safety research actually. And probably one of the most famous examples is the Zeebrugge ferry disaster, where there was a lack of role clarity over whose responsibility it was to close the door of the ferry. And ultimately, it was catastrophic. It impacted that. So there's a whole range of the impact of what a lack of role clarity means, both at an individual level and at an organizational level.
Why do you think people end up with this real lack of clarity about their role?
This is a bugbear of mine, Rachel. I'm making it my mission in 2026 to really talk about this. It's called job analysis. It sounds really boring and really dry because we want to talk about much sexier things. Job analysis is basically what it says on the tin. It's when we're creating a role within an organization, or indeed filling a role that has perhaps evolved since the last time we recruited for it. What does this job now look like from a responsibilities perspective? What do we need it to do? How do we need to function within the organization? How does it interplay with different team members or leaders or stakeholders? How do we know that this job is having impact? What are the outcomes we expect to see both within the team and at a broader level? Then we look at, now we know what the job is, what are the core competencies we need in a person to be able to fulfill that role? What competencies are going to be predictive of somebody's performance, future performance in that role? Competencies can be things like communication skills, for example, be a competency. So what it means is when you've gone through this job analysis process, you have a clear idea, not only of the person that's needed, but what their responsibilities are. So really, a person who isn't sure if that's their responsibility or not should be able to go to their job description and go, well, is it in there? And we know that 99% of the time, It's not, because this process hasn't been gone through with the intention of making this really clear. But the benefit of going through that isn't just on the individual, it's on the team as well, because we know how they're all interplaying, how they're contributing to the overall mission of the team and the organization. So it comes back to a very fundamental, foundational aspect of organizational psychology that's been around for, I think, probably more than 100 years at this point. But it's a step that's skipped because we don't have time. We just need to recruit somebody now. We need to fill the role. We need to get them in there. And as we said earlier, shortcuts are usually shitcuts.
So much to ask you about that. But the thing that's jumping to my mind, first of all, is that you say, 99% of the time, the job description is not up to scratch. We don't know what we need. I would say almost 100% of the time in medicine, we don't even have a job description. And we never have had a job description. It's like, we're recruiting for a portfolio salaried GP. What do we do? Well, you're a GP, so that you do GPing. Yeah, we need a clinical director for our medical department, for our geriatric department. So what will you be doing? Well, you'll be directing the department. That's it. And I, for one, have pretty much never seen a job description ever, because the problem is when you qualify in medicine, you're programmed to think, well, my job is everything. And actually that is instilled into you because the system wants you to absorb everything that nobody else will do. When I was a junior doctor, as they were called in those days, working 120 hours a week. If people decided that wasn't their job, I had to go and do it. If there's no ECG machine in the surgical assessment department, which there wasn't, I had to phone round every single ward in the hospital when I was on call with patients waiting to find the ECG machine. Then I had to go and get it and wheel it down to assess the fact, it was madness. So we just end up with this idea that A, we carry all the clinical risk, and B, if the job hasn't been done, then it's ours to do. And I think we do end up with what you said, and I can see myself having done that micromanaging, because, and doing stuff, and I can still see myself doing this, because you feel so responsible, you micromanage people, and then maybe you undermine what other people have done, not because they're not any good, not because you think you're brilliant, but you just feel so responsible for it that you're so worried about something happening with either your name on it or being under your watch that's going to go wrong. Is that a pattern that you see in other places, or is it just in healthcare and really high stakes jobs?
It's in every organisation. Yeah, it's a universal factor of organisational life, but it's the stakes are higher in healthcare, aren't they, as you say, in terms of the clinical risk and responsibility. So yeah, it plays out across organisations. I think there is an element though, which you talk about all the time on your podcast, is this responsibility trap, this overreach in terms of what is my responsibility and what isn't. I think that is heightened in healthcare organisations, but that's not to say it doesn't exist, in general.
I guess in healthcare, the consequences feel much, much worse. Someone might literally die if someone hasn't checked that blood result and filed it and contacted the patient and say, we need to get you seen, your potassium is far too high, or something like that. So we use that. But as I say, I think that is used a lot as an excuse, because most of the time somebody isn't going to die. Most of the time, what we're worried about is how we're seen by other people, or what it says about us if we don't take that task on and it's left undone. So this over-responsibility thing is really hard. And this is a real eye-opener for me, we're talking about, actually, because I talk about a lot of the way of dealing with over-responsibility is to ask yourself, is this my task or not? But actually what you're saying is, if you take a step back and everyone asks, whose is whose task, and we get that role clarity. But I'm thinking of someone driving home after a 13-hour day going, we don't even have time for lunch break. How on earth are we going to have time to get that role clarity within our team? Is there a shortcut, not a shitcut, to getting that role clarity without having to do a whole HR process of documenting every single thing that goes on in your job?
Yes, you could have that conversation as a team, as a line manager. You can take that time to look through, if you do have any job descriptions, or start to map out what the main tasks are, what that workflow is, getting consensus amongst the team in terms of what expectations we'd call that a team charter, and that's going to include tasks as well as behaviors, expectations, values, how, the values of the organization are translated into our specific team and department. That's still going to take time, and it's still going to take intention and effort. And ultimately, I'm sorry to say, that's what needs to happen. We need that piece of work up front to be done to then give us the structures and systems that we need to be able to function within them. And I totally understand somebody's listening, probably going, it's never going to happen then because we never have the time. Somebody's going to have to take responsibility for that. Somebody's going to have to, and hopefully it'll be a manager or somebody in HR, or ideally partnering with HR to do it. Because as we're seeing, without that, role clarity continues, the overwhelm continues, the burnout continues, and the system breaks. It's one of those things where something has to break, and it's either going to be the cycle that teams are currently in, or it'll be the individual, or it will be at an organizational level. And, we've already seeing cracks in that, aren't we, in terms of what's been happening with the NHS over the last five years or so. So there are ways you can do it more informally, of course, but it's still going to take time and effort. But I promise you, it's time and effort well spent.
Yeah. And unfortunately, a lot of our listeners work in places where there might not even be an HR department, or the HR department is the one for the hospital. So there's like 5,000 people working. So they don't know. But I think there are things you can do for yourself and your team, which I'll come on and ask you in a minute. It's interesting what you said about the discretionary effort, because I guess if you don't get this role clarity, then you get everyone's like working so hard, overworking. And there was a House of Commons report published just after COVID, and Professor Michael West, I think, wrote it. And they said that if NHS staff stopped working overtime or stopped making any discretionary effort, then the whole system would just collapse. Okay. The NHS wouldn't work anymore. And so I think that's a really good example of something that you talk about a lot, which is that of what you tolerate, you teach. What you tolerate becomes culture. But we have all just tolerated this for so long. It's the analogy of the frog in the pan. Sometimes it's because we haven't noticed it's happening, and it's just happened very, very slowly. So we just assume it's normal. Are there any other reasons that may be a little bit more negative that we just tolerate this going on?
There is a ongoing myth that busy means productive, that productive equals performance equals success. And whether that's wearing burnout as a badge of honor, whether that's telling ourselves that this is just the way things are, this is what work looks like, because it's steeped in, very transactional roles. It's almost going back to, manufacturing in the 1920s, when we start to think about this type of stuff. And it was kind of like more hours worked, more widgets made, more success. And it's much more complicated than that in organizational life today, but particularly in organizational life that involves other humans and interactions and relationships. And there is just this lag in terms of what we see productivity is, how we measure productivity, and how that actually translates into performance. And I think particularly for our colleagues who are maybe older millennials, Gen X and above, this was very much a narrative that we were told from our parents, because that's how it used to work. You'd work hard, you get a salary, which means you can afford to live a fairly comfortable life. You do that for 40 years and then you retire with a nice pension. That isn't really the reality of life anymore, particularly with the cost of living crisis and the continued stress on our global economies. But that's a narrative that's still there, and it's so baked in that it's gonna take a lot of individual introspection or reflection to break. So there's things happening at a societal level, there's things happening at a generational level and an individual level that, the story we tell ourselves about work ethic and what it means to be successful.
Totally agree. And I think in medicine and healthcare, we define ourselves and our identity by how successful we are, which then equates to how busy we are sometimes, even though we don't like being that busy and we know the effect it's having on our health. We we don't have any other operating playbook because we always have been like that. And we are so used to working so hard and work taking up every single bit of our spare emotional energy, thinking about it at home, thinking about it on holiday. And just as a side note, I recently looked at the Workaholics Anonymous quiz about work addiction. I don't know if you've seen it. There were 20 questions. I don't know if you can remember many of them, but if it's not too personal an answer, if you ask those 20 questions of yourself, where do you think you would score?
Now, probably fairly average, neutral. Now, if you'd have asked me 10 years ago, very much so. But I've had to work really hard, as you say, to unravel my identity from my work and my profession and make a broader assessment of what my identity means. And that one of the most valuable tools that I ever used to do that is from an incredible psychologist called Dr. Audrey Tang. It's very much a positive psychology exercise, and it's called Vitals, which basically stands for values, interests, temperament, around the clock, so the time of day you feel you're most effective, your life goals, and your strengths. And it's going through this exercise, just an introspective, reflective exercise. What are my values? What's important to me? What are my interests? Where are my strengths? Where do I feel like I'm really kind of, kicking ass and doing great? What do I want to achieve in the future? All of these different elements, with the theory being that if our vitals are being met, then we experience positive well-being. If too many of our vitals are being compromised, that is impacting our well-being negatively and is more than likely going to result in burnout symptoms if this is prolonged. What I also used it for was to look at where are my vitals being served. If they're all just coming from my work and I lose my job, then how am I going to sustain myself in terms of having any meaning or purpose in my life? So how can I spread those vitals out? What's coming from my community? What's coming from my friends and family, my relationships? What's maybe coming from hobbies or side hustles that I might have to spread out my vitals? So if one aspect of my life, it changes, then I've still got other sources that are going to fuel me.
I think that is so, so important. We forget to do that. And I think probably one of the very unconscious drivers that is driving our overwork is, well, if I stopped, where would I be? Because a lot of us have very unconsciously let things slip at home. We've let things slip with our friends as we have given our all to work. And if you look at that Workaholics Anonymous 20 questions, and I'll put it in the show notes. So I did it recently, and I was like, oh, I haven't scored too badly. I think I've scored like 8 or 9. And it's questions like, work sometimes wakes me up at night, worrying, or, I think about work when I'm on holiday, or I have often stay late doing more work and stuff. And I thought, yeah, I've scored pretty well. And then I looked at the key. It said, if you've answered yes to more than 2 or 3 of these questions, you may have a work addiction problem. I was like, my God, it's pretty much the job description for medics that we answer yes to most of these. But when I looked at it, I thought it was a real wake up call for me, because a lot of those questions I just assumed that was just how the world was. That was totally normal, but it's very much the sort of Protestant work ethic that has instilled those sort of that way of working. I didn't realize that was considered a problem until I read it quite recently. I was like, oh my God, like literally the entire NHS should be going to Workaholics Anonymous if you go by that questionnaire.
It's one of those things, isn't it, where sometimes a label can be useful for people because they see it as a way of, okay, this highlights something that I need to address. For other people, it can just serve to further spiral them. So take that test with caution, depending on how you're currently feeling at the moment. But equally, I'd say, I think these tests are useful because it's kind of like a little litmus test, isn't it, of how you're doing. Equally, they're oversimplified by design, but they're also oversimplified in a way that can be a little bit problematic. So, for example, I wake up in the middle of the night thinking about work. Yeah, I'm sure the majority of people do. What do you do when you wake up in the middle of the night and think about work? How do you respond to that? That's the key in terms of, are you a functional workaholic, or it's a problem? Do you lie awake for the next 2 hours thinking, worrying about it? Do you get up and start working on that problem? Or do you do some kind of breathing exercise to try and calm your nervous system down and try and go back to sleep, or engage in another rest or recovery activity? It's the response that's really important in terms of whether you are a workaholic and whether that's going to have a negative impact on your health and life, rather than I wake up at night thinking about work.
That's a really good nuance to it, because you can't help what your brain naturally defaults to, can you? And when you are in a high stress, high stakes job, you are going to, in fact, actually, I sometimes have woken up in the middle of the night, and thank God I did, because it was like, shit, I forgot to do that with that patient.
Yeah, or you finally figure out the solution to the problem. You're like, light bulb, that's it. And you maybe have a little pad, or you type a little note on your phone.
Exactly. So it's actually the brain working well, but I love that. It's then what you do with it. It's a bit of a wake up call, because what we've noticed, and I don't know if you've noticed this with your people, is that we preserve our performance at work while the rest of life goes to shit. And the work is the last thing that suffers, actually, and everything else has suffered first. And I think that's just such a tragedy.
It is a tragedy. And as well, it's kind of, again, it's another myth we tell ourselves that, well, if I can just keep work going, then everything will be successful. Well, believing that we operate in a vacuum, that having problems at home isn't going to impact how we show up at work and how we perform. It's all interconnected in a similar way that, you might feel that you're as productive, you're as effective in work when you're experiencing stress, when, things are in other aspects of your life and in work are getting on top of you. We can feel, and we've seen this in research, that people will rate themselves as being very effective when under stressful conditions. Whereas in terms of task success or how effective you've done that task, it dips significantly the more pressure that's on us in those moments. So it's a coping mechanism. Our brain is telling us to keep going, because otherwise we would potentially stop and have to deal with those consequences. So it's that myth that we need to try and break ourselves out of.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Richard Duggins, psychiatrist, works with practitioner health, has just written a book talking about the burnout cliff. So you think you're fine. And then, there is that exhaustion curve where often people in burnout, their performance goes down as they head towards burnout. But if you're one of those people that's preserving their performance at work while everything else goes down, you get to the cliff and suddenly, boom, you drop off it. And I think that's why burnout can sometimes be so dramatic in these sort of high achievers and high performers at work. And one of the ways that we talk about beating burnout is not about doing more well-being. It's not about getting more resilience, because I think that is a product of setting boundaries, saying no, protecting your time, managing your energy, and keeping yourself at that top of the curve in your performance zone. But I think in healthcare, we really struggle with the saying no and setting boundaries, because it feels like a dereliction of our professional duty. It feels like we're letting our colleagues down, heaven forbid we dump on our colleagues. That's like the cardinal sin. But as you were talking about role clarity, I was starting to have another light bulb thinking, actually, what if instead of going in with really hard boundaries, what we did is started to get more role clarity? That would make the conversations quite different, wouldn't it?
It would. And often with, setting that kind of boundary, it's always better, it's always easier to enforce a boundary that you can control. If you're asking somebody not to do something, that's quite hard. If your boundary is, I will do this, then that's going to be, much better. So it could be that that's the conversation, that these are the tasks that are going to be done. I'm happy to take responsibility for that aspect, that element. If there's nobody else wants to take that, if I'm not stepping on any toes, if I'm the best person to do it, I believe I am for these reasons, that's a better way to go about it. But really it is this communication with people, and it can feel so labored and so unnecessary and formal to sit down and go, let's talk through this workflow and what exactly who is responsible for every single aspect of it. But as we've talked about, that is what is required to build role clarity at a very granular level, to then have that really strong foundation to build on in terms of what happens when a a unique task comes in, and how are we going to deal with that? How are we going to respond to this? But yeah, it's starting with task cohesion. If you're looking at a team who is starting to break, who is, there's a little bit of infighting, there's a little bit of incivility, look at task cohesion, because it's probably where it's more than likely a source of frustration, and will absolutely help you to then rebuild the social cohesion, the team cohesion that you're going to feel. You're going to feel kind of walking into a room, into a team. You're going to feel good about being around that group of people.
And what would you say to someone who has tried to get some role clarity, and they've seen there's some tasks that aren't being done, and they might be the most senior in the room, the most responsible. They might be like the business owner or the GP partner or the director of the service. And they've tried to say, okay, I've raised this. There's this thing that needs to be done. No one else is volunteering. Everyone's like, oh, yes, if I keep quiet, then I know that they're going to do it. What would you say to that person, the one who always jumps in and just then has to absorb it and has to do it? How could they raise it with their colleague as something that they really think that one of their colleagues should be doing, without just fearing the judgment and the upsetting people and I think a lot of us just avoid conflict and don't get clear and don't say to someone, actually, I think this is probably something that you need to be doing, because we don't know how to raise it, and we're so frightened of what will happen if we do.
It comes back to, again, I believe, as the leader, the manager, whoever is in charge of that team, is looking at not the people, the jobs. Think again in terms of that job analysis, even doing something informal yourself. What is everybody's job? Roughly, what are their responsibilities? What are they accountable for? What are their measurable outcomes? How do we gauge success in that role? And then look at the task, and where does that task fit in that job? Because it does feel personal. It is personal. It's our work, as we talked about. It's wrapped up in our identity. And very few people go to work every day wanting to do a bad job. We want to do a great job because it gives us a sense of purpose and meaning in our life. So it is personal. But often it can feel less personal if we roll it back to tasks and jobs and who's the best person to do it. Another thing I see as well is leaders that will take on those tasks. Oh, well, I'll do it then because my team need more time. They don't have the resources. I'll take it on. And often they're the worst person to do it because they don't either have the competencies, it's not in their skill set, it's not their strengths. And it's, they're doing lots of things averagely, where if you looked at who actually is the best person to do this, you could have 10 people doing one thing brilliantly. And that's more effective for the team. It's always going to be difficult if there is somebody who, for lack of a better word, is people pleasing is their default. They find it very hard to say no. Again, I would say, and it's going to take a lot of effort to have this reflection. Are you the best person to do that job or that task? Can you do it well enough? Does it take away from other tasks that you have that are then going to be, substandard because you haven't had the time and attention to give them? And ultimately, it comes down to having to be a little bit selfish in a way, to kind of think I'm not the best person to do that. It's going to add more onto mine, and it's going to impact our outcomes, our performance, our patient care. Let's look at this as a team. And it could be that, again, it's laboured in finding the time to do this. I appreciate it's hard, but even you just find 15 minutes a day for 2 weeks to talk about these things, these tasks that need doing, and who's the best person to do it and why. I would always recommend that process is guided by a manager who's thought through how these roles interact with each other and contribute to the overall success of the team. But yeah, those conversations and that group consensus is going to be what's needed to move forward.
I think it's the depersonalizing the stuff, the issue, the task, not the person, is really helpful. What about the leader who is sort of genuinely afraid that somebody's going to be harmed if they don't step in or if they pull back?
In terms of somebody who's at risk of burnout, do you mean? Or?
No, well, it could be, in healthcare, if I don't sort of step in and do that task, one of my team is going to go off with burnout. Or if I don't step in and do that task, what if something gets missed and there's a risk to the patient? That's the biggest barrier to delegation, I think that there is, apart from there's no one else, there's no one to delegate to. When we talk to doctors about why aren't you delegating that, that's something that a competent administrator could do. A, we don't have one, but B, clinical risk.
What happens when that happens again and you're not there? It's okay to feel that you're the best person to do it, have that feeling of control over a situation to minimize the risk. You can't be there every single time. So in the long run, you're probably putting people at risk by not figuring out a way that this task will be picked up. And it could be it's collectively, whoever's in the room at the time. It could be a check that's happening. It could be, yes, this one person is responsible for it and they're shadowed by this person. The fact is, if you're basing patient care or managing any type of risk by physically being there to do it, then you're not managing that risk.
That's hard to hear, but I think people need to hear that, because the patients need seeing all the time, even at weekends. I remember in a training session, someone said, I can't just go home on a Friday night, because what if there's a sick child that needs seeing at 7:00? I've just got to keep seeing them. And someone said, well, what if there's a sick child that needs seeing at midday on a Sunday when you're not there, right? And we forget that, and we forget that we're not indispensable, but we get such discomfort when we feel that by not doing it ourselves, either something bad might happen, there's fear, or we feel guilty that someone else might have to do it and be inconvenienced. Or I think underneath there is this feeling of shame that we get, where we feel that if I don't do it, if I say this isn't my task anymore, or if I give it to someone who is also very busy and they don't really want to do it either, what does that say about me as a person?
Yeah. And again, it comes back to that. How do we define ourselves? What's our identity, and what is feeding that? And sometimes we might need to get a bit brutal with ourselves, a bit difficult, ask ourselves the hard questions, because it's very easy to cling to something as our identity, and particularly if it's one thing, because it feels like it's easier to control. It feels like it's easier to grasp. It's part of who I am, and it's part of, particularly in healthcare, it's part of who, how society defines me. Whether it be the clap for carers we saw during COVID, whether it be the blue light discounts you get in Subway. There's a societal expectation on healthcare workers, on people working in the NHS. But there's an element of, if I'm not taking care of myself in terms of my time and how I effectively use it to make sure I'm the most, not only the most productive, but the most effective in terms of the care that I'm giving, then ultimately I am further down the line going to take away from the quality of care that I can give, because you can't do it all. Something is going to break. And whether it be something in work or something at home, nobody wants to feel that they're failing. And often work can be the area that we prioritize for success. But I will not feel comfortable if I'm smashing it in my job, but I'm being a terrible wife and partner to Al, because I would never want to describe myself as a bad partner, an unkind partner, a partner that is causing stress, unnecessary stress, or unfair levels of stress. I don't have children, but I wouldn't want to be the person that feels that, my child doesn't feel like I spend enough time with them because I'm always tired when I get home from work. I just need to sleep. I don't want to be the dog mum that doesn't take my dog to the park because I just don't have the energy to do it. There's so many aspects of our life that, and again, going back to something like the vitals exercise we talked about, spreading your own risk in terms of your sense of identity, spreading your own risk in terms of what you're capable of. And I know there's going to be people listening who are in this trap of thinking, well, this is just the way it is and I can't control it. And the fact is, you can. And I know you've had guests recently talking about this in terms of choice and control. And it's a hard habit to get into, and it's a hard cycle to break. But inevitably, if you don't break it, your body will. And that's what happens with burnout, like you're saying with the cliff. If you don't take time to take care of yourself physically and mentally, your body will find time for you. And what's going to happen to all those tasks that only you can do at work then if you're, not able to work for months on end? It's such a difficult thing, particularly in an organization where there's so much pressure and so under-resourced. But this is where, again, it comes back to finding ways to protect yourself at work and at home. Because if you don't, we know what happens. Everyone knows what happens.
We know what happens, but I think we sometimes see it as a sign that we are very compassionate and self-giving and stuff. And let's say society does love altruism. And so, burning out at work, it can feel, and people feel very ashamed when they burn out because they say, why can't I cope? And we say, well, look at what you were coping with. It's actually a normal physiological response. So it's not to blame people for burning out. But what we don't say is that keeping yourself at the top of the curve, setting boundaries and not doing everything, that is a professional skill that we need to learn and reward. It's not self-indulgence. But organisations don't seem to put that as a KPI or as a performance indicator. And are they doing that more in the corporate world now? Or is that just a bit tokenism and, let's just put in some wellbeing interventions and tell everyone they've got to be well, but we'll still keep the pressure on?
There are absolutely organisations out there that do have this as a metric. They'll have employee engagement, wellbeing as a metric. I don't hear of many where it's actually tied to leader performance. I'd very much like to see that in terms of leadership salaries and bonuses being tied into the psychological state of the workforce. I think what's challenging is that well-being has become a bit of a buzzword, and it has become one of those things where it's tied to very ineffective interventions like resilience training that don't really work. In fact, I think the latest data shows that it's in terms of effectiveness, it's very, very low and probably only lasts up to a month after said training takes place. Wellbeing is as much of an organizational responsibility as it is an individual responsibility. And equally, we're starting to see a trickle of tribunals coming through that are linked to psychosocial risk factors in the workplace and how they have been mismanaged to cause people stress to a point where it's been very detrimental on their health. Wellbeing is as much about the resources you have to do your job. It's as much about how relationships are managed in the workplace. It's as much about how we are recognized in our work in terms of salary, in terms of pay, in terms of benefits, in terms of career progression. These are all things that serve us in terms of, again, our sense of purpose and meaningful work and fulfillment. It's very difficult for an individual to have much control over organizational levels that are going to support well-being. There are elements that we can look at, like we were talking about role clarity. That's a really big one that's going to impact. But it is those things that individuals can do when they don't have that control that are going to make a difference. And one that I think is really, there's two that I think are really simple that I talk about to people is, number one, how much of your annual leave allowance are you taking? I know I can't go off because my colleagues need me. There's no one else to do it. I understand. But again, if you're not taking that time to rest and recover, your performance will be impacted and you will be less effective for your teammates. The second one I talk about is understand the difference between rest and recovery activities. So one thing that I'm sure you hear a lot as well, Rachel, is people feel guilty for taking a rest. I can't stop because if I stop, I feel this sense of guilt that I'm just not able to do that. I just can't sit still. I'm just one of those people. I just can't sit still. They're usually the types of things you'll hear. Rest is more than just sitting still, lying in bed, watching TV. Rest is also about recovery activities. So if you're one of those people that struggles with rest, struggles with staying still, what are your recovery activities? What are the activities that bring you energy? And if you're just on annual leave at home, we just had the Easter holidays and you're there with, you're looking after the kids. What are the activities that give you energy back? Whether it's cooking, whether it's going for a walk, whether it's going to lunch with friends, whether it's reading a book. think about your recovery activities as well as those aspects of rest.
I love that. I think with people in the NHS, I think we're pretty good at taking our annual leave because we know we would not survive if we didn't. But yeah, a lot of the annual leave is taken doing childcare, covering, or, doing recovering in order just to go back and work really, 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 really hard to the next bit of annual leave. But we're not doing the handover very well. And what we're not doing is managing our rest when we don't have annual leave. So if you do have a weekend, you spend half of it working anyway, not actually going, what is it I need to rest? And I think, the trouble with well-being is that well-being is an outcome. It's not something you can teach people. It's the outcome of them having enough time to do those things, to do the cooking, to do that and all that sort of stuff, which brings you right back to being able to set boundaries around your work. And I think role clarity is going to really help that. So just before we finish, Leanne, if someone was thinking to themselves, well, okay, I'm not in charge of the team. I'm not the team leader here, but I can have conversations with my team. What 3 top tips would you give to people so they can start to find a bit more role clarity for themselves, which will then help them get clearer about what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing, which will hopefully then make the default responsibility land on them less? Does that question make sense?
It absolutely does. I think the first thing is a really simple reflecting exercise. At the end of each day, just make a note of what you felt you did today that wasn't within your job role, what you felt you shouldn't be doing, or maybe somebody else would be better served doing, maybe some tasks that got overlooked because there was nobody to kind of put their hand up and do it. What have you been doing in your day that has just sucked your energy and sucked your productivity? Make lists like that. And essentially you're doing your own mini job analysis in terms of what your job looks like. And once you have some data, people are usually pretty good at responding to that because you're showing them observations rather than opinions. Have them taking that to a colleague, maybe, somebody, other members of the team, possibly to a team leader or manager if you feel comfortable to do that, and say, this is what I've observed. I've been doing this for a couple of weeks. And what I've realized is that I spend at least 2 hours a day doing this task, whether it be answering emails or something that is completely unproductive, but it's just managed to squeeze its way into the workflow of the day, but it's not serving anybody. It's not actually moving anything forward, and it's not helping our patients, clients, or customers. Why does this thing exist? Question it. Be curious. Is there a reason we have to do this that I'm missing? Is there a reason? And you know what? Often when I talk to individuals and teams that have done this, it usually ends up being something legacy. Oh, we always used to do that because that system didn't do it. Well, now that system does do it. So, it's just updating things. So have that reflection yourself. I think the second thing would be to, if you're able to, have a conversation with your manager in terms of what are their expectations of you in your role? What does success look like? How do you know I'm doing a good job? And if they're not able to be specific about that, keep asking questions, keep saying, well, what is it that my role does? Is it something to do with patients? Is it that I organize as part of a work process? Whatever it is, nail it down. Because what we often find is that either a manager hasn't even thought about the expectations they have of their team, which isn't very helpful, because if they don't know what success looks like, how do I know what success looks like? And once those conversations happen, we often realize that I am doing things that I believe I need to do to be successful to meet expectations that don't exist. The expectations are actually a few levels lower in terms of what is within my area of responsibility and what my performance looks like. And the third would be, and I know it's going to be the hardest for everybody listening, is invest in your rest and recovery time. You have time. You're just not prioritizing these activities. And there are so many things that we can do to just breathe life back into it at the end of a busy day that are simple. We have so much research now that shows just spending 10 minutes outside amongst trees is wonderful. It's called forest bathing, which I think is a bit weird, but
lie under a tree for a bit.
Yeah, it's weird, but it works. Or go to that that meal that you had planned with friends. I know you can't be bothered. Of course you can't, because you've had a busy day. But understand what's happening in your body. You are in that very classical threat state. And physiologically, that means that all of our blood is rushing away from our prefrontal cortex and going to our amygdala. It's our emotional brain, and we can't think clearly. And the first thing to happen is we retreat, because we feel that we need to protect ourselves and protect our energy. Whereas actually going and being social, building those relationships is probably the single best thing we can do for our psychological health and our physical health. We know the famous study that's been happening, over decades, 70, 80 years, is it now? Relationships are the biggest predictor, not only of life success, but longevity. They are not the things to neglect.
Yeah, absolutely. And the great thing is those wellbeing things like rest and relationships, they're really fun. Like, you could do some performance enhancing stuff, like I don't take a lot of pills or do huge amounts of exercise and all that sort of stuff. Or you could go and rest more and see your mates. I think I know what I'd rather do.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely.
And I love those tips. And the other thing that's occurring to me, if you don't just audit what you've done that's not in your job role, but if you also write down the bits that I did extra that kept me work because I was worried about the risk and what might happen. And then you can look at it in the light of day with with a colleague or your partner or manager, whatever, and say, actually, where was the safety net for that bit of risk? Why was I doing that there as extra? What systems do we have? And if there aren't any systems that meant I was doing it, great. Well, we've identified we need one. And where was I just not working with the safety netted systems that there already are, because I have this either overblown sense of my importance in this system, that can happen sometimes, or actually just feeling guilty for dumping it on the colleague that should be doing it anyway. And they would be fine about doing it, so what is it that's driving that? And then, because once you get clear, and this whole thing is about clarity, role responsibility, Brené Brown says clear is kind, doesn't she? Things are so much easier to tackle, aren't they?
Yeah. And as you say, collect the data, get objective about it, because it's hard to do that when we're so in it. And particularly if we're experiencing stress, it's hard to be objective. So collect the data. And that is, it's simple as writing down at the end of every day, what did I do that gave me energy? What did I do that took energy away from me? What did I do, as you said, that I felt I had to do because there was a risk of me not doing it? Do that for a week, a couple of weeks, and then take that data to your team, to your manager, and have those conversations and get, the word of the conversation, get some clarity.
And if you're working in a team department and you are the leader, just get your team to do it. Say, like, okay, today write down everything you've done. Is there anything that you're not sure whether it was yours or not? Let's have a conversation about it. And then you can raise it when it's not a confrontation situation. It's just a team discussion. And so you're not in your fight, flight or freeze zone. You're just having a chat about how can we make this team more effective.
Exactly.
So much in that, Leanne. There's so much more I want to ask you. So will you come back another time to talk to us?
Of course. Anytime. Always.
Thank you so much. So, Leanne, if people want to find out more about you and your work, of course, there's the Truth, Lies and Work podcast, which I'd highly recommend. But where else can they go to find out about you?
If you want to find out a bit more about our work, oblonghq.com is our consultancy. We help organizations build amazing workplace cultures and do things like job analysis, which sounds really boring, but actually has a big impact. And LinkedIn, I'm quite active on LinkedIn. So come over and follow us there. And if you want to listen to the podcast, you can find it wherever you listen to podcasts, or head over to truthliesandwork.com.
So thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.